Thanks for coming to the 2015 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. This lecture series has now been running for over 20 years. It's brought to you by the Wilderness Institute at the University of Montana. And we have a series of programs that we run year-long. We recently just kicked off our first international program in Patagonia, Chile, so that's where I was with several students over the last several weeks. But the lecture series is my favorite part of the year. It's definitely, I feel like, the most exciting education and outreach opportunity that we can provide not only to students but also to the public. And putting together the topics and the speakers every year is a really awesome adventure, and I feel really lucky to be a part of it. So this year, we decided to focus the lecture series on additional values of wilderness that we might not typically talk about as a community of wilderness enthusiasts, educators, outreach specialists, agency personnel, and over a campfire discussion a few years ago with one of the district rangers down in the Bitterroot National Forest, we got to talking about some of the values of wilderness that sometimes go unspoken. And one of those is the incredible value of research to wilderness areas and how valuable wilderness areas are to those of us that are researchers in these more wild and remote places throughout the world. And what's really cool about doing research in wild and remote places that you might have to take a train to get there, or a float plane, or a series of trains and float planes and then a canoe, is that there tends to be some amazing personal stories that are wrapped in that research activity. And so what I've asked this year of the lecturers that are going to come and present to you is not only to talk about their research and what they do as professionals out there in the field, but also how this kind of work in remote places has shaped them as individuals. And you'll probably come to find that each of them have a personal story that's deeply woven into their adventures out there in the wild. So to kick off tonight, we originally had scheduled Shannon Donahue, the Executive Director of the Great Bear Foundation. However, as often goes with folks that work and live in remote areas, she was unable to get from Haines, Alaska to Missoula, Montana, thanks to some weather. Thankfully, Dr. Frank Tyro, who's a board member for the Great Bear Foundation, is going to take Shannon's place tonight and provide us with some wonderful stories of the North Country. So just to introduce Frank Tyro to you, he is involved with the Polar Bear Field Ecology course through the Great Bear Foundation and has been for over 30 years. His background includes 46 years in broadcast media, and he brought local public television KSKC to the Flathead Reservation in 1988. He teaches video production, photography, and mass communication at Salish Kootenai College in Pueblo, Montana. He's currently working on a documentary, Walking Bear Comes Home, which is a documentary on the life and work of Dr. Chuck Junkel. And for those of you that have gone through the Wilderness and Civ program in prior years, we've actually done some work with Chuck and the Great Bear Foundation over the last many years, collecting apples up in the rattlesnake, having him give bear talks to different classes in Wilderness and Civ. So the Wilderness Institute has had a long-standing personal relationship with the Great Bear Foundation, and we're happy to have them here tonight. Dr. Tyro also has a bachelor's degree in film and TV from Montana State University, a master's from Temple University, and a PhD from Union State and in the University of Cincinnati in e-learning. He lives in Pueblo right now with his wife, Dr. Lori Lambert, who he actually met while working with bears in Churchill, Manitoba. And Churchill, Manitoba is considered the polar bear capital of the world. So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Tyro to kick off this year's lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you, and I do need to introduce Monica, who is here in Missoula at the Great Bear Foundation office. And I want to thank the Institute for allowing me to pretend to be a bear researcher. That is not my background, and I need to just say that I'm not a climatologist or anything else other than someone who is really interested in the Arctic. I've spent a fair amount of time, in addition to Churchill, in other areas of the Arctic. But to give you a little bit of background as to why this is such an important part of my life, I want to show you the preview of the Walking Bear Comes Home documentary that Shannon and I are working on. And so we'll do that first off.
This guy walked in my office one day. He said, "I'm John Tenner. I'm with the Canadian Wildlife Service. We want to start a polar bear study. I hear you know how to work on bears." So off I went, and I worked for many years with the Canadian Wildlife Service, developing all the study techniques and the management programs that we needed initially, and got all that work done. Been to a lot of the Arctic. I've probably worked in more parts of the Arctic than just about anyone else on Earth. When I first started working there, I was about the only guy working in the high Arctic and in the wildlife area. None of the other biologists had extended things like caribou work or Arctic hare work or mustelid work or anything into the Arctic. So I was kind of all alone in terms of Canadian Wildlife Service. We were trying to get from the weather station at Eureka back down to Redwood. The weather just wouldn't settle down.
And we left it off, and we got to Norwegian Bay, and suddenly, like it tends to do, it sucked in. We were inside a ping pong ball. Half the time we didn't know what was up, what was down, the right or left.
Never have figured out on the map where we were. Neither I had, but we came around this point, and it was instant whiteout.
So let's follow the coast. Anywhere we're flying, oh, it's a bit clear there, let's go there. And then, oh, clear over there. So we were sort of zigzagging, trying to get out of there. And I remember looking between my feet, and I saw rocks racing under my feet, and I yelled at Gene, "Pull them up!"
What happened? I said, "Well, we hit the ground." So he was all flustered, and I don't know, he was trying to get control, and we hit the ground again. And we were sliding along, it would have been okay, we hit a little drift and rolled over. And that was the end of the helicopter.
And suddenly it was dead silence. And the chopper was lying on its left side. You had the pilot, then you had myself in the middle, and then you had Chuck. I'm trying to get out, I couldn't get out. I couldn't figure out why. And he said, "Take your damn seatbelt off," you know. And I hadn't taken my seatbelt off. I was trying to lift the whole helicopter. And Gene's yelling, "She's gonna blow, hurry up, she's gonna blow." And there's no aircraft much fly over that area to track your signal. If you were calling Mayday, Mayday, you know who's gonna hear you, you know, except the polar bears, they're no help. And the bubble was still, you know, was cracked, but it was intact, and none of us was hurt. And so we were away, of course. Radio didn't work. The emergency locator did not work. The battery was gone dead, because in those days people didn't pay much attention to that. So we pitched a tent, small pop tent, and we took the seats of the helicopter and used that to sleep on. And we had a little bit spare food left. We were munching on that. Suddenly in the distance, butt, 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 butt. And Gene suddenly blurted, "There's another chopper, another chopper." So we all run out of the tent, and we all were on our bare feet. And it was maybe 15, 20 below. It didn't matter, we didn't feel that. They were putting along with their radio turned off, drinking coffee, going real slow, feeling their way along in the weather. And they went right on by us, and then they started turning. And so one pilot said to the other suddenly, said, "Holy mackerel, look at that! What are those Inuit doing there, all the way out here? Let's go have a look." And they came over, and then said, "Look at that, chopper lying upside down, chopper crashed." And so they landed beside us, took us in, and flew us straight back to Resolute Bay. where we landed the next morning, and we got out of that big helicopter at Polar Shelf, and the guy that runs Polar Shelf said, "What are you guys doing here in this helicopter? Where's your chopper?" Because the radio had been broken. He didn't have any idea, nobody had any idea in the world that we had crashed. And in that country, we could have been there for weeks and weeks before anybody, if ever anybody, would have found us. That was like divinity. You know, God had smiled upon us and, you know, given another lease on life there and rescued us.
Sometimes wonder if, you know, if I did really crack up one of those times, and that everything that I'm talking about and seeing and doing now is that period just before you die, when everything flashes before your eyes. And for all I know, maybe a minute or so ago, we may have had a crash landing, and you're just flashing by. In that 1 minute before you're dead.
Years of waiting become centered north as you leave warm reservations to travel unknown trails, guided by knowing you are the center of the universe wherever you are. You try to walk with all beings, knowing you do your best to do what is right. Your feet are light as song, walking bear song, that urges you on to country of your ancestors, the Cree and the Chippewa, and walking bear comes finally home. Was it ancient scratches on glacier-polished granite that told you your ancestors were waiting? Was it high wind that geese ride north, or those owls who sang the great snowy, those owls on tree at your door at old Dixon Agency? You want to paint your face of color mixed with red granite and Hudson's Bay water as a sign that you take your place at council fire with bears to talk of relatives, to share songs. You remember teachers singing who Walking Bear was as you scratch your joy deep in smooth, hard stone, and Walking Bear comes finally home. Well, thank you.
So that's an introduction of who Chuck Jonkel is and why it's such a special place. As was mentioned, I met my wife there quite a few years ago, and it's always been a really special place. The person whose poetry you hear there is Vic Sharla, and Vic came on this trip in 1989. And in many ways, it changed his life. One of the things that happened was that he had not written for quite some time. And he is a playwright and a poet. And so that trip inspired this book, Swift Current Time. And then some of the poetry from that then ended up in this poetry book called Pouche, which is good enough. And Vic and Chuck are just kind of like two peas in a pod. They're both kind of those ancients that have such knowledge. So Churchill, the first time I was asked if I wanted to go see polar bears, I said, sure, when are we leaving for Alaska? Which is a fairly typical response. But Churchill, Manitoba is called the polar bear capital of the world because it's the most accessible place in the world to see bears, and of course it's right on this shelf here on Hudson Bay. One of the things we need to first think about is what is the Arctic, and there are a number of different definitions. And actually I gave this talk at one point, and a person came up after and said that his master's program had been on defining the Arctic as a social idea. And so again, you can see that, of course, one of them is the Arctic Circle, which is very imperfect because it's just a big circle on the map where at least one day of the year the sun doesn't rise and one day of the year it doesn't go down. But then we can also use above the tree line. I'll show you a map of that. We can also use the 50-degree isotherm, which is the average temperature in July. And we can use the existence of permafrost. All of these are different ways to look at the Arctic, but they're all pretty imperfect. So the tree line, obviously I live on the reservation. We've got a lot of area above tree line, so that's really not a very good definition either. I believe we do have some permafrost in Montana, and so again, that's probably not the best way to think about the Arctic. So again, here is Churchill Wapusk National Park, which is the Cree word for white bear, was established in 1999. It's much different than what we consider national parks in the United States, because grandfathered in were the ability of the locals, not just natives but locals, to hunt and trap. And there are many other things about it that doesn't quite fit sometimes our definition, but again, it depends on what your idea of wilderness really is. I do want to point out a couple things that we'll see a little bit later here. This is an older map. They call this the Belcher Islands. It's now called Sanikiluaq. And down here is the polar bear park. This is a provincial park that's clear down here, and there are polar bears clear down into this area in James Bay. Some of Chuck's work was done on North and South Twin Islands, which are down in the bay here as well. Also notice York Factory, and we'll talk a little bit about that as I go along here. This is my favorite map. This is what Santa Claus sees. I think we sometimes are so intent on thinking about ourselves as North Americans, not really thinking the fact that people in South America are Americans as well. But I really like this because it shows really what the view would be of someone who lived, say, in Greenland or Ellesmere, or even some of the other areas here in the Arctic. So that's a fairly typical winter day in Churchill. That was from 2 years ago. We experienced that last year. And in fact, we had one day in which the whiteout was such that it took 45 minutes to go about 12 miles. I had to keep coming to a dead stop because it was just total whiteout. Temperatures are, variable. Some years it's been colder in Montana than when we get there. But of course, this is what we're after. This is what people are so interested in seeing. This is an ice-adapted bear, and you can see by the shape of its head that it's much, much different than a grizzly or a black bear. So this, of course, is the brown bear, grizzly. There's other names for them. But in actuality, these are the same bear. This is the white phase, this is the brown phase. They can interbreed and have fertile offspring. In fact, this Pisley, shot in 2006 on Banks Island, and since that time an offspring of a Pisley has been identified. Polar bears have the ability to float. Their hair is hollow. It's not really like a fiber optic tube, but their skin is black, which again is one of those adaptations that really help it to work, be able to live in an Arctic environment. They can dive down and stay down. I've heard somewhere between 45 seconds, maybe a little bit longer. They will swim down and try to surprise a seal that's on ice, but generally the primary way that they catch seals is when the ice is frozen and there are breathing holes which the seals set up. This is the primary food. This is the ring seal. They're quite small, about 125 pounds, and they make up the vast majority of the diet of polar bears. This is a bearded seal. They're quite a bit larger, up to about 450 pounds. They can also be a pretty good source of food for polar bears. Bears will occasionally try to separate a young walrus out of a group. It's a very dangerous thing, and oftentimes the bear loses out because they've got some pretty wicked weapons. Occasionally they are able to take a young pup. This is what really puzzled Chuck when he first started working in the Arctic, and that was that he would come across this, and first time I saw a picture like this, I thought it was a goose. But that is a seal, a ring seal, that has been stripped of its fat and skin. But again, what's puzzling is why would the polar bear leave the best part? I mean, isn't the best part the meat, the protein? He was able to work with a physiologist, an MD, that he met at a NASA conference. Back in the 60s and early 70s, there was the thought that humans could be put into a hibernation state for long-distance space travel. And so he told this conundrum to the gentleman, and he said, well, you know, I got an idea, but let's go up and figure it out. And really what they figured out was what's called walking hibernation, which is that the bear is either living off its own fat or the fat of the seal. And seal fat and skin has a lot of vitamins and minerals. When you break down fat, you get energy and water. And you need a lot of water in order to digest protein. And so that's why in general, now obviously the first couple seals, they haven't eaten for maybe 4 months. They would probably gorge themselves. But once their metabolism is back up and running from the summer season, this is what they leave. We stay at the Northern Studies Center, which is 16 miles outside of Churchill. We get to Churchill by train. There's only really 2 ways to get to Churchill, is to fly or take the train. The road comes within about 175 miles of Churchill, but you can't drive there. So one of the ideas that Chuck cultivated was that we want this to be part of the experience. And so originally we would carpool, and everybody who could would pitch in and take a vehicle, and we'd leave on a Saturday night, drive straight through, and get on the train on Monday morning. Well, I rebelled against that a few years ago, and we finally convinced Chuck that it made a lot more sense to spend the money, stay overnight in a hotel, because we'd had a few incidents, let's say, in our caravanning, like a vehicle rolling over, or having some issues with getting stuck or running out of gas, all kinds of interesting things. So now we take a bus from Sailor Scrutiny College. We used to drive to a small town called the Paw. Now we go to a town that's actually a little bit closer. And because they had changed the train schedule, we leave Saturday morning from Montana. We drive 500 miles to Swift Current, Saskatchewan. We stay overnight, drive about 325 miles the next day to a little town called Kona. So on Sunday evening, we get on the train at 8 o'clock at night. We get off the train Tuesday morning in Churchill about 8. We have 5 full days in Churchill, and then we reverse the process. We really encourage people to work with us in that way, because I see an awful lot of folks who get plopped into Churchill having flown in from New York or God knows where else, and really not experienced the changes in the geography, the geology, the ecology, and the sociology. You know, people are different in different places, and one of the beauties, I believe, of our trip is that we meet a lot of folks, a lot of local folks, as well as other travelers on the train. The train passes through a number of reserves which have no other connection to the world other than an emergency air ambulance or the train. And so we've really met some interesting people and made some great friendships of people that we've met on the train who are traveling to Thompson, which is actually a town with a Starbucks and a Safeway and a Walmart, because their little village might not even have a grocery store. So this is looking out the window of the old Northern Studies Center, and the reason for the bars should be pretty obvious. This is a photograph of about midnight, I guess it probably was, and if you look closely here, you can see that there's somebody wanting to get in. There's actually a door right over here, and Shannon heard somebody pounding on the door. Well, we're not supposed to open that door, but she thought, well, gee, maybe there's somebody out there, they're trying to get in. And luckily, Jenny noticed this before she opened the door to allow the visitor in. This is the new center, $21 million LEED Gold certified building, an amazing structure, the best accommodations for probably 800 miles in any direction. It is a research center, and so the summer trips that we offer, we're generally only allowed a small number of participants because that's when the researchers are there generally. This last year we had 30 people on our November trip. This year we have 35 slots for the November trip. The bad news, it's already full. We have a waiting list. But officially we only have 2 people signed up for the summer trip, and I'll give you information on that in a little bit here. But it's really an amazing facility and a great place to see the Arctic. This is what's called Bear Jail. And I won't spend a lot of time talking about that, but that's where the bears go that have had some kind of a run-in with people. And again, I like to, mouth what Chuck says. There's really no bad bears, there's just stupid people. Lots of culvert traps. In the fall of 2013, there were 3 people mauled in Churchill. The first one, 2 o'clock in the morning, had never been in Churchill before, stumbled out of a bar. What do you expect? Second one was 5 o'clock in the morning, the night after Halloween. Folks, again, had a little too much to drink and were headed out home, I guess. So a lot of the problems are, really you just have to forgive the bears. I mean, this is a summer trip. This is my granddaughter who, if you stay near the coast, the wind is always blowing, so you don't really have to worry about the bugs. But I always got to take people just a few miles in so that they can really experience what 3 months of mosquitoes is like. This is looking over the Owl River denning area. Chuck was the person the white guy who discovered it. Obviously, a lot of other people, native people, knew about that. But this is looking east and a little bit south of Churchill into the area that is really dual purpose. The pregnant females go there in November, December to make a snow den to cub. The male bears are there in the summer, and they dig dens against the permafrost to stay cool and away from the bugs. The other thing that's really interesting about Churchill is that there are 3 cultures, well, really 4 cultures that have place names. The Inuit didn't come down there a lot. That's a little bit south for them, but they have, there's a book of place names on the desk over here. The Saisi Dene also used to be called the Chippewayan. They frequent that area. They actually have a number of villages west of Churchill, and then northern Cree. And so this crossing of cultures, it makes for such a rich and diverse environment in Churchill. Of course, this is what people are there to see. Generally, we have really good sightings. One of the things that people have heard about are the what are called Tundra Buggies. And I'll show you some pictures of those. But for example, we spotted this mom and cubs about probably a half mile out. This was fairly close to the Northern Studies Center, and we just stopped the bus and started watching. And so again, we are very particular about trying not to impact them, but they came right up to the bus and walked around the bus. This guy, most polar bears aren't white. That is, they're fairly easy to spot on the snow because they are much more of a yellowish color. This guy looked like he'd just come out of the beauty parlor. I think what had happened was he was down in the bay swimming in the salt water, and he had a nice blow-dry job there and I've never seen one really that color. We see a lot of bears with peat stains. This is probably a male, and that's for where he was tucked in on where he cut a bit of a area that he could get next to the permafrost, but also there's quite a bit of peat, so that stain is there. How do you tell the difference between a male and a female? It's tough. Chuck thinks he can tell usually because the females have a broader head, and in fact it's almost impossible to keep a radio collar on a male because of the slim neck. The other thing is if you can get close enough to see the urine stains, you can tell a male from a female. We do get close to bears, obviously a telephoto shot. Often they come right up to us. They do a lot of play fighting in the fall. This isn't serious, it's just a lot of play behavior. So there's a typical cast, one of Chuck's casts of a polar bear print. Their feet are huge to help them be able to walk on ice and snow. And then, of course, grizzlies have much longer claws and a little bit more elongated. This is an extremely disturbing photograph. This is a banana. And garbage is always an issue in the Arctic. What do you do with it? Can't bury it. At one point, Churchill was shipping it out to Thompson, but then they, I think, multiplied by 10 times the cost. And so this is a real big problem. Corky Claremont, who is the retired director of our art department at the college in Pablo, did a series of prints. I mean, if you think about bananas in the Arctic, I think you get the connection. And this is even worse. These bears are drunk. That's because there is a port. The reason that the rail line was built to Churchill is because there's a shipping port. And somebody had the bright idea that the gleanings from the grain, I'm not sure how they disposed of it before. They might have shipped it out, but they decided to just dump it out on the tundra. Well, it sits there in the summer. It starts to heat up a little bit, and pretty soon you've got alcohol-infused grain. These are the different areas that were identified by Dr. Jonkel back in the 60s. They've been only slightly modified since then. This is before he'd really had a chance to do a lot of research, but he did this by simply looking at the geology and geography of and some of the ways in which currents and different things ran. So here's the western Hudson Bay population, which is around Churchill. You can see the population trends, deficient data because the Russians really aren't doing anything to try to, right now they've got other things on their mind. These are the declining populations. Increasing population is interesting. This is an area where there's a bunch of really tight passages between islands, so that McClintock Channel is the one area where climate change really hasn't affected the populations as much. Alaska, there's a lot of issues because of the ice receding out farther. When I first heard about helicopter pilots seeing bears that had drowned, I thought, I just couldn't believe that. But if you think about 30, 40 feet swells and a mom and cub trying to swim out to the ice, and it used to be 8 or 10 miles and now it's 50 to 100 miles, it's understandable. This is what some of the tundra looks like. This is actually some of the boreal forest on the way to Churchill, and again, this is why I find it so interesting to see this change in the environment as you go north. There's a lot of black spruce, white spruce, birch, lots of willows and other types of foliage. Great place for beavers and moose. That's why we go to Churchill in July or August. These are the most vocal whales in the world, the belugas. Belugas are pure white. The calves, when they're born, are a little bit off gray, and they don't really turn pure white until they're about 4 years old. But one of the things that was interesting that happened, I think back in probably I think it was the late 80s, we were up there and someone had brought a wetsuit. And so one of the things we do is we go out on a little excursion to across the river to look at the fort, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the belugas come right up to the boat, and so the fellow we were with had a hydrophone. That's actually a recording I did 3 years ago from the hydrophone. So he dropped the hydrophone in the water, and we were listening to the whales, talking to each other. And our student got in her wetsuit and slipped into the water, and instantly the conversation changed. They knew instantly that there was something foreign in the water. There's a really interesting CD that was done by a professor at the University of Manitoba that talks about what we believe these different types of sounds are. Obviously, they're used for echolocation, but there are also other sounds that really seem to be types of communication that are privy only to the whales. There's 3 ways you can see the belugas. This is a zodiac. You can also rent. You can get on a big boat, and you can also rent kayaks. But as you can see, they're very curious. They come right up. This is from, I think, 3 summers ago, tail flip. They're only about 16, 18 feet long. They're not a huge whale, but they're really pretty. The other thing about summer is that that's when the berries, the belugas and the bears and the birds are out. There's about 16 different kinds of berries, and if you wonder why all the geese go north, if you're ever on the tundra, you'll know why, because there's literally millions and millions of pounds of berries that fatten up all of those migrating birds. This is one of my favorites, cloudberries. They look a lot like a raspberry. They're, I'm sure, related. You can see the leaf looks a lot like a raspberry leaf. They're just a little bit slightly lighter color. And there's all kinds of blueberries, cranberries, gooseberries, almost everything you can think of. They just grow so prolifically. One of the things we do in the summertime as well is to allow people to touch the permafrost. And that's fairly easy to do if you find the right spot, because you can just dig down and pull out this peat and eventually get down to what feels like rock, but it's super saturated soil that is frozen solid. One of the other concerns, of course, is that in places the permafrost is beginning to melt. The other thing I didn't mention, which I should, is that really Churchill is now considered subarctic. It's really only at 58 degrees north. That's on par with Juneau, Alaska. It's really not that much. It's pretty close to Edinburgh, Scotland, as far as the northern latitude. Again, because of the tree line, the permafrost, and various other things, it has many of the attributes, but it's also an area where much of this crosses over. There's caribou, there's moose, there's red foxes, and there's Arctic foxes. And there are polar bears, and really not very far south are brown bears. This is a map of the area where the town is located, up on the point here. Across is what's called the Fort Prince of Wales. Somebody tell me what this is? The dump? This actually doesn't go out far enough to show where the center is that we stay at. It's 16 miles out. The adaptations that we're all familiar with, many animals we see around here, but also this is an Arctic hare. In the summertime, they're little brown jobs. Arctic foxes, that's a winter shot. When I first saw this, I had some of my grandkids with me, and these are some sled dog pups tied up. And I was looking at this one trying to figure out, well, where's his collar? Did he pull his collar off too? That's an Arctic fox in the summer. And he knew exactly how long the chains were because while we were sitting there, he wove his way in between, just out of reach of the dogs, and found a bone to bring out to chew on. This is in October, and this one is still turning. You can see some of that dark coloration is still there, but within another couple of weeks, he'd be pure white. We have ptarmigan in Montana, and ptarmigan are really pure white. They're really hard to see, especially in the willows. This is how they turn white. This is in the fall. They turn white from the bottom up. So if you can imagine a little skiff of snow, how difficult they are to see. So the other thing that I really enjoy about the Arctic is, again, that diversity of people. These are two parkas. This one is made out of seal skin. And you can see the way that they're made. There's an awful lot of artistry that goes into that. This one is a caribou hide parka. What you heard also was what's called throat singing. Throat singing is generally done between mother and daughter, and it's again a way of expression that I think is just really intriguing. So this is a really fancy parka. This is from a museum collection. Obviously, this wouldn't be everyday wear, but you can see how amazingly beautiful the artwork can be. The other thing, obviously, is that many peoples, tribal people on the Flathead, use dogs, but also, of course, in the Arctic, they're very important. Grise Fjord, which is the only established town on Ellesmere Island, and I believe maybe one or two of the other communities on Baffin Island have outlawed snowmobiles. The reason is that if you go 300 miles out on a snowmobile and it breaks down, you're in big trouble. If you go 300 miles out with dogs, you probably can survive. Sheila Watt-Clothier, who spoke here a number of years ago, did a lecture called Our Right to be Cold. Talks about the igloo and how the amazing architecture of an igloo. You know, where else could there be 40 miles an hour wind, 40 below zero? Inside the igloo, your kids are running around naked. In the kayak. This is a parka. This is from Sanikiluaq, those islands that are over on the Quebec side. And this is made out of eider skins. They don't have access to caribou or seal, and so they make their parkas out of eider skins. Each one of these is the back of an eider. Goose down, duck down, pretty good insulation. They're not quite as rugged as other types of skins. I think in general they figure they'll last about 3 years before they have to make a new one. But again, just an incredible adaptation. And that's probably the world's first raincoat, probably either walrus or seal gut. And you can see all of the sewing that's done to create an incredible raincoat. This is some of the artwork in Churchill. This comes from other communities. This I got up on Baffin Island. It really looks to me kind of like a Picasso. I just love that. And there's a lady, Myrtle de Mulez, who is a Cree who has revived an art called Caribou Tufting. And so this is caribou hair that is shaped and formed with scissors to make different scenes. Just really amazing stuff. And these are some of the typical things that come from some of the other areas. Usually each village has a particular thing that they specialize in. Cape Dorset, there's a book up here that has a lot of their prints. These probably come from probably up on Baffin somewhere. I don't recall offhand exactly where. But again, the thing I just love about these is that they're not always totally realistic, but yet are they? Because one thing I've seen is that you think about, you know, these poses you see bears in that looks like they're dancing, and if you watch a bear long enough, you'll see some of that behavior. This would be a shamanistic portrayal of seals, and oftentimes there are combinations of human and animal figures together. Speaking of animal figures, here's Chuck doing one of the things that we always do in Churchill, which is to try to make an igloo. We sometimes kid Chuck that some of his igloos look more like teepees, but they're really a lot of fun to build and to get inside. One year that we had built one, we were leaving that night. We'd put a candle in it, and we were leaving to go to the train that night, and we drove by and slowed down so people could see, and here was an Arctic fox camping out inside our igloo. So this is who was supposed to be here, Shannon. Shannon is the executive director of the Great Bear, has done an incredible job of keeping Chuck's dream alive. And this is a person I met 26 years ago in Churchill, my wife, Lori. We typically get around in Churchill in a bus. The really only way to get around is in vehicles. There's not a lot of roads. Like I said, 16 miles from the center where we stay back to town, and then there's a bunch of side roads that we can go on. You've probably heard of some of the Discovery Channel's 10 best beaches or 10 best. This is one of the 10 best bakeries in the world in Churchill, Manitoba. Originally it was opened by a Portuguese couple. They sold it to another Portuguese couple a few years later, and it is absolutely amazing. This is my grandsons, my son-in-law, and Lori. I've taken 7 of my grandkids to Churchill. They all know they've got a free trip when they can work it in. I now have a great-granddaughter who is going to have to be put on the list, I guess, here pretty soon. She's only 3, so we got a little time. This is my rendition of a parka. I made this using actually reindeer hides, which are a little different, mainly just the coarse hair. But, boy, I'll tell you, that thing is warm. This is expedition weight jacket that I usually take to Churchill, although about 3 years I didn't even take it because it wasn't that cold. This is one of my other jobs, is to carry the firearm. 2 of my favorite people, Chuck, and this is Vic Sharla, whose voice you heard with the poem and also singing a song that has to do with bears. And these 2 people have greatly influenced my life because of Churchill. So again, we have polar bear, brown bear. So what are these? Polar bears? In the rainforest? Spirit bears, yeah. Also called Kermode bears. They're a white phase of a black bear. And so on Princess Royal Island, you often have mom and cub. About 1 in 10 are pure white. It's a double recessive gene, and there are very few of them. They are threatened because if they don't build the XL pipeline, how are they going to get all that oil out to the coast? Well, they're going to go to Kitimat. And here's Princess Royal Island where the white bears are, the white black bears. Any kind of a spill is going to be devastating. So here's the way most people think of getting around in Churchill. These are Tundra Buggies that are a way to get to places where you can't get otherwise. They are I believe $500 now for one day. You're able to go into areas that are off limits to other vehicles. They are not without problems. In November, they haul this monstrosity out to the Cape, and for, I believe, $5,000, you can stay for 3 or 4 days. I think this is sleeping quarters here. This is probably a some type of a facility to cook and feed folks. And so you can hang out there with the bears for just a few $1,000. This is the port. Because of the ice, it's only available to ship grain for about 3.5 to 4 months. It takes about 3 to 4 days to load one of these big grain ships. And so there's only 25 to maybe a maximum of 30 ships that can come in and out of there. However, because it's closer to Europe than Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is the major shipping port in Canada, there's some advantages to it. The Russians offered to put a nuclear icebreaker in there and keep it open year-round, but the Canadians turned them down. I won't spend too much time on this. I think it's pretty evident. This, in the western Hudson Bay, which is the Churchill area, this is a graph that shows the ice breakup. As I mentioned, we've been going to Churchill for 30 years, and Steve Running says you really can't say anything about anything unless you've got at least 30-year period. You can see there's a lot of outliers here when the breakup was, but that's the average. And the freeze-up has varied greatly as well. The first year in 1984, it was already frozen up. We saw bears a mile out on the ice. And over the years, now I'd say it's at least a week after we leave, which would put it into late November. It's been as late as December, mid-December before freeze up. And so the bears really have nothing really much to eat. I'm just going to go through these quickly. Are there any birders in here? I won't insult you. So, sandhill cranes in Churchill, we have them in the missions. Camp robbers, Arctic terns, 30,000-mile journey, mom feeding. We have these in Glacier Park as well, hawk owls. This is a fairly rare bird. This is a white phase of a gyr falcon. Beautiful. We've seen them probably at least half the times we've been in Churchill. People will fly to Churchill just to see these two. They put them on their list. Pacific loons, bald eagles, goldens, all kinds of... I've never seen a stork, I'm sorry, not a stork, a blue heron sitting in the top of a pine tree around here. We see a lot of them up at Nine Pipes, but also cross foxes. This is a cross between a silver and a red. They're really beautiful. And the northern lights. In 2012, we saw the best display I've ever seen. It just blew me away. I know I'll never see anything like that again. It went on Tuesday night and Thursday night. And, you know, you'd be looking over here and somebody'd say, well, look over there, and it just blew me away. Churchill is in the band of highest incidence of northern lights. Goes through Churchill, up through Yukon and Fairbanks. Coming up in about 2 weeks, there's a field trip to Churchill just to see the lights. February is the best time to see them because of, in November, oftentimes you get fogged in or low clouds. I'm going to kind of stop here. I do have quite a bit of information about the military history of Churchill. This is the fort, and I'll just say that this was built to protect the fur trade. They thought they could build it in 4 years, took them 40. French took it over without a shot. Really interesting place. So the only other thing I wanted to mention here is, anybody know what this is? Just up the road. It's Fort Kona. That was the last Hudson Bay trading post built, and it was built in America before there was a 49th parallel. But the interesting thing about this is that if you put your boat in over on the other side of Glacier Park, you can float all the way to York Factory. York Factory is the huge depository where the Hudson Bay Company kept the furs until the boats came in with all the trade goods. There's a lot of other military history. This was the last rocket launch. This is why the Northern Studies Center was called the Rocket Range. They launched a lot of suborbital research rockets there on atmosphere, on northern lights, all kinds of different things, all suborbital. So I can't stop without telling you at least one bear story. And a number of years ago, I think it was probably in the late 80s, two friends of mine who were on the trip had decided to rent a small little tracked vehicle. It's kind of like the ones they use to on ski slopes to groom. And so it's a four-seater. And the fellow who was running it, the price was the same whether you had 3 people or not. And so they said, well, Frank, you want to go along? And of course, I'll go along. The guy had cut a hole in the top of the vehicle, and he had a cover with bungee cords that held this little cover, this little sunroof, you might say. And it was perfectly situated over the back seat, so that it was a great place, because, you know, it's only about this tall. And so we were out, and, you know, bears all around, and we were watching this one particular bear, and we were taking turns standing up, taking photographs or videos, you know, standing up on in the back through the sunroof. And so we were watching this particular bear, and I think Barry was sitting next to me. We were both sitting down, and the hatch was open. And all of a sudden, something hit the back of the buggy, and a big white paw came down to fish a seal out. And oh man, we came to life pretty quickly. And the guy who lived there, whose vehicle it was, immediately started the engine, which scared the bear off. But it had kind of a trunk on the back, and so he had hit that, and then he was right down with his paw trying to see what he could fish out of the seal hole. So after we cleaned the seat and went on our way. But so it's been fun. I hope I haven't given you too much here. This military history is interesting, but I just want to leave you with a couple of things. These are the dates for July 25 to August 4, November 7 to 17. This one's full, but we are taking people who want to put their name in, because we often have people who cancel. There are brochures up here, a little pitch. I've been to Churchill 35 times. I've never been paid, and I refuse to be. I love it so much. And so nobody really makes any money. The money that comes from this trip is used for bear education here, particularly in the Missoula area. Shannon works out of Haines, Alaska, where we have an office, and she's doing research on the bears on the Chilkoot River and human interactions. Here's the price. That's from Missoula or Pablo. It's slightly higher if you go through Winnipeg, which you can if you went to Winnipeg and got on the train there. We do not promote our trip as the least expensive, because even though it is, we feel it's the lowest impact, and the people who run it are very, very knowledgeable. So that's the information. There's a bunch of books up here. Here's some of my favorites. Anything by Fred Brumer. There's 3 newer books up here as well on Churchill and the bears. And of course the old standby, Arctic Dreams, Barry Lopez is a must read for anyone. Questions? Yeah.
Do you guys do any work with Polar Bears International in Churchill?
We don't. PBI was established by Dan Garovich, and it has moved now over to Bozeman, as you may know. They do a lot of promotion of particular scientists, and they have funded some research. They've got a lot of money, and we're kind of a small fish, but we believe that we also provide a lot of information. They've done some good work. That's what I'll say. Anything else? Yeah.
What elevation is Churchill?
Sea level.
Okay.
The highest point is Knight's Hill, which I think is 80 feet high. Pretty flat. As you go up the train, there is, I think you might get up to maybe 350 or 400 feet elevation, but that's about it. It's pretty flat country.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you feel is the native population's place in wilderness areas or in studying wilderness areas? Do you communicate with them? How do they feel about you being there? I don't know, I'm just interested in that.
Well, Churchill is really pretty metropolitan because of the flights, so people come in there quite often from various places. I don't know how many of you watched a program on PBS. Let's see, this is February. This last fall there was a program on PBS which I wrote letters. It was a veterinarian from Britain who flew into Churchill to solve all their problems. And then he went up to Arviat, which is the native community just north of Churchill. And there's a lot of issues because primarily of garbage and various other things. I mean, he was using drones to try to spot them. That didn't work. What he ended up doing was hauling dead seal 5 miles out of town to try to track the bears out there. You know, the native people have been living with the bears for a lot longer than most of the rest of us. And they've always had a great respect for animals, for life, for those things which feed us. And I think some of our Western ideas are sometimes counterproductive to that. There are permits available. One of the things that Dr. Jonkel did was to work extensively on the United Nations agreements that the 5 polar nations that had polar bears, which established hunting quotas. There were only 5,000 bears, we believe, in the 60s. Now there's about 25,000. And I think a lot of that was because of those quotas. Now that doesn't mean that, you know, bears are protected completely. The communities get a certain number of licenses and they can sell those to people who have a lot of money. And however, those quotas have helped to bring the bears back. And so, you know, it's always kind of a two-edged thing. You know, in some cultures, there are parts of bears that are valued more than others that are thought to be aphrodisiacs or various other things that can be quite destructive to animal populations, particularly bears. But, you know, there are people who have said, well, there's no more polar bears in 50 years or 25 or 35 years. I don't think anybody can make that claim. I think there's too many things that we don't understand to make any kind of prediction like that. I think we really need to be aware of what's going on in the Arctic because that's the canary in the coal mine. If you want to talk about climate change, go up to Barrow, up to Baffin Island, Grise Fjord, Svalbard. and talk to the people who have been there for 10,000 years. They have a lot of things to say. Another question? Yeah.
Have research organizations like the one you're associated with and other conservation groups, have they run into conflicts with some of these indigenous and native populations as far as the way they have, like their traditional life ways and food ways and things like that with what you guys are trying to do with the bears, or even just general?
I can't think of any direct conflicts. There are always different ways of looking at things. You know, Western culture generally likes to think there are scientific answers to everything. And sometimes maybe there are spiritual answers to things, other ways of looking at those ideas, those conflicts. I know I didn't answer your question, but.
It's okay. I mean, it's a large, broad question. I mean, really just like conflicts, like what you might see in temperate regions in Africa with, like in the Maasai, when tourism runs up against subsistence-based livelihoods and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. There will always be those conflicts, I think. What I gather from the times that I visited with Inuit in particular, who probably are the closest to the bears, you know, they have great respect. They don't wantonly kill things. They kill things in order to subsist. Raw internal organs of seal are 4 to 6 times more nutrient packed than cooked. We had a student stay with us from Kungiganac, Alaska last quarter, and I think she thought she was going to make me cringe or something, but she said, "Oh, I just got a call from my folks. They're butchering a seal on the kitchen floor." I've seen that. I've eaten seal, and you know. So anyway, you know, I have a lot of respect for the idea that those indigenous cultures often have answers that we haven't even thought about, the right questions. Anything else? Yeah.
How specialized are these animals, or how adaptable are they to the changing environment?
That's a really good question. 2 of the books address that up here. They found that polar bears are raiding eider and goose nests in the summer, eating a lot of eggs.
That's something they didn't do earlier.
Pardon?
That's something they didn't previously.
Yeah, right. And also, we've seen them pick through the kelp, and there's black mussels up there, there's starfish, and they're eating the kelp and various things. But the thing you need to think about is whether or not that can replace that huge caloric intake that the fat of the seal and the skin, you know, provides. It obviously may help to tide them over. Again, one of the things that I've done a little bit of looking at was, when did the brown bear and the white bear split? And there's different opinions. One of them is 5 million years ago, the other one's 100,000. So that's a little hard to figure out what that where that really happened. But there are substantial differences in the ways that their bodies digest. One of the things that Dr. Jonkel did back in the 60s was to put a polar bear on a treadmill to measure the amount of the respiration and the metabolic process. And one of the things that really surprised them was that the weight of the limbs of a polar bear mean that they're expending quite a lot of energy in order to move, much more so than a brown bear. And so again, there's some pretty major differences. One of the things that Ian Sterling was the person who Chuck hired to take his place at the Canadian Wildlife Service. One of the things that he did was to calculate, because somebody said, okay, well, there's all these flightless geese when they're molting. You know, can't they live off of those? And they can catch them, but what he found was that if they chased the goose more than 15 seconds, it was a nutrient deficit. So again, you might say, well, there's all this stuff out there, all this food for them, but yet, is it something that is capable of providing that nutrition they need? I mean, essentially from about mid-July, early July to mid-July, when the ice breaks up, there's really no large nutrient intake that they can access. And until the freeze up, again, you know, that can be as late as mid-December. That's a long time to not really have a lot of food in your stomach. There have been bears that have starved. There's pictures of some of them. Some, you know, certainly it could be from disease, but or other problems, but that can happen. Yeah.
In the summertime, like during breakup, do they ever gorge on berries?
The cubs will eat berries, and they'll eat a few. We've seen the cubs especially pulling berries off of bushes. The adults seem to be more interested in the stuff on the beach. And obviously, if a seal or a whale washes up, you know, they'll certainly go after that. It's the grain leavings that bother me, and the other things that, you know, again, the human-caused issues that are impacting them. Yeah.
So you're talking more about these like human-caused issues, and I know that a lot of us in this room probably feel like, you know, there's no super bear or no bad bears, and more like bad people. Is tourism seen as like more of a problem? Do you see that, like the Great White Bear Tour or whatever that huge like monstrosity was? Is that like an issue, and is that like adding to this trash problem and all this bad stuff, or does it spread like?
Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't like the buggies. It's like a zoo out there. There might be 6 or 8 buggies, and they're supposed to stay on established roads. There were roads established by the military to check on their artillery practice. They used to shoot bears with artillery. They used to shoot bears out the back door in the garbage pile at the rocket range. The buggies are a mixed blessing. It brings people to Churchill. It probably, because some of the interpreters are actually pretty good. But generally, I'd have to say I'm not real happy. One year, one of our participants, now we don't discourage people from going on the buggies. We help arrange that for people. And we just say, you know, go in with your eyes open. Well, one of the drivers got off the path, and so one of our people that was on the trip reported that the guy got fired. So it turned out they were both on the train going home the same night, on Saturday night. Luckily, the bar car was open, so they both got drunk and became good friends. But the thing that I have always, you know, I had a discussion with a participant from another group this last year, and he said, well, you take your folks out on the buggies, don't you? And I said, well, no, they can, but we don't, you know, that's not part of our trip, but we help to arrange it if they want to. And he said, well, how do you see bears? The bears are on the coast. I said, yeah. The coast goes all the way from Churchill 30 miles east. And the behaviors that you see of all of the animals out on the Cape where there are tundra buggies, I mean, you know, what's natural? I don't know. To me, it's really not. And I said to him, well, why are the bears there? And he looked at me like I was asking the weirdest question in the world. The bears are there because the buggies are there. Again, I have to be kind of careful. Tourism can create wonderful economics, but one of the things, having lived on the reservation, that I know is that tourism is not clean. It creates an awful lot of problems if you're not ready to deal with them. And the government of Manitoba has limits on how many buggies can be out there, where they go, but all of this was just never regulated until 2 years ago. They put GPS on the buggies, so now they know where those buggies are, which is a great thing because, again, they were supposed to stay on these established tracks. Well, somebody else goes over here, the driver says, oh, well, that's a track, so he follows that track. And, you know, again, we've had people tell us that, you know, they'll surround maybe a mom and cubs on 3 sides. That's not good. There is predation by male bears on cubs, and if you create a situation where that is more likely to happen, I don't think that's a good thing either. Yeah.
So I know you're not a primatologist, you said that, but for the McClintock Channel population map, you said that it was minimally affected by climate change. Do you think you can elaborate on that? 'Cause I thought that
It's because the islands are very tight, and in some areas the channel between the islands is less than a mile, and so it holds the ice in there, and so it's kind of like a microclimate. Well, it's bigger than a microclimate, but that's what I believe is the reason for that. Now that map has been updated, and if you saw, there were little circles that showed the populations of some of the different areas, and actually McClintock is not a real large population anyway. The weaning weights are down, the infant mortality is up. We used to see lots of twins and and occasional 3 cubs, and there seems to be fewer. I mean, the twins are normal, but I think there are more one of the twins that are dying, either getting eaten or because of lack of nutrition or whatever. Again, that's just a layman's interpretation. Anything else? Great questions. Is there one up there? No?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I have a couple of things to give away. There's actually some postcards up here if you'd like to grab. I'm afraid I didn't bring enough for everybody. This is a poster that I did a couple years ago. So who can tell me the first year that Great Bear went to Churchill? What year? 1985. Nope. Okay. So what's the seal that is the primary food source for polar bears? Why that? Who? Ring. It's ring. Who said that first? Close enough. Oh, just one more thing. This is what fueled the fur trade. Beaver. It's really soft. There's a bunch of other things up here if you want to come up. Do you have anything else? Okay.